Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I am a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph. I haven't done a long form introduction in a while, so I'm going to give it a go, see if I remember how to do this. I am a doctoral student in dogmatic theology at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, where I am studying Christology or writing a dissertation in Christology. And I'm in year 2 of 3. So I live at the convent of St. Hyacinth in Freiburg, Switzerland, and I am just working on St. Thomas on Christological exemplarity. Is any of that interesting? It's hard to say. You be the judge. All right, in this episode, we're going to talk about fasting, which is a perennial teaching of the Church, but for whatever strange reason, has been kind of set aside or at least de-emphasized in past years. And so there's a movement abroad nowadays, 2021, to recover it, to repropose it, and to live it, as it were. So let's go for it. All right, so the question is fasting, and the question is given by one Brian York, who says, is it better to fast on Fridays and be grumpy because you're hungry, or just abstain, but do it happily? So let's start with some definitions, and then let's talk about some virtues, and then let's talk about spiritual growth. So there's your itinerary. Let's go about filling it, completing it, fulfilling it. That's the word. Yep, bingo. All right, so the distinction here is between fasting and then abstaining. So usually this comes up in the context of the season of Lent, but whether or not you're going to watch this video in Lent, I can't control that, so I'm just going to talk about it as a perennial feature of life. So fasting is the idea that you would just have one meal a day. Now, you can also have 2 collations, which are like smaller meals, but those 2 meals taken together do not equal the size of your one meal. So if you think about it practically, let's say you have like a meal at midday, and maybe in the morning you have a muffin, and maybe in the evening you have an apple. Something like that would be a traditional fast. And you would not typically eat in between meals. Now, a lot of folks practice this by just eating bread and water. So fasting on bread and water is a typical go-to. So you'd have just one significant meal with a couple of pieces of toast or a couple of pieces of, bagels or something like that. And then you might just nibble for 2 small collations, but the entirety of the day you're just eating bread and then just drinking water. Now, abstinence pertains specifically to meat. So these would be the days of the year, like Fridays in Lent, for instance, where you are, free to eat whenever and whatever, except that you are not free to or not permitted to eat meat. 2 days of the year, so Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, where you are expected to both abstain from meat and then fast. So typically fasting is undertaken in addition to abstinence. The idea is that fasting is more difficult than abstinence. So if you're going to give it a go, you need to be prepared for it in some way, shape, or form. Does that mean that you have to be able to do it joyfully, or that you need to be able to do it without getting a headache or getting grumpy? That's the question. Okay, so now let's transition into a conversation about virtues. The pertinent virtue here is temperance, okay? So temperance is a cardinal virtue or a moral virtue, and it informs our sense appetite. So it informs our passions, or what is sometimes called emotions. And specifically, those passions which see the good and pursue it without too much complexity. So we would typically divide the emotions into those that are more complex and then to those that are more simple. The more complex ones, it's like you see something good, but maybe it's difficult to get there, and so you have to, gin up some hope, or maybe you see something good, but it's impossible to get there, and so you experience despair. Those would be examples of complex passions, whereas the more simple passions would just be like love, desire, joy, or delight, these types of things. Now, what does temperance do? Well, temperance moderates our enjoyment of sense pleasures, so that way we don't become enslaved to them. So specifically, food, drink, and sexual appetite are the types of things that temperance concerns itself with. Why? Well, because those would be the most basic instinctual drives that the human person experiences. So, and it's good that we do experience those things, otherwise we would blink out of existence. Think about it. If you don't eat or drink, you die. If you don't procreate, then the species dies. So it stands to reason that we would have strong instincts for these things in order to ensure that we hand on life, or in order to ensure that we preserve our own life. But with the fall of man, these instincts are, maybe perverted is too strong of a word, but they're twisted, they're bent, they are deprived of grace or despoiled of grace and then wounded in their very nature. And so it becomes necessary to heal them and to elevate them with a life of virtue. And then, speaking specifically to these sense appetites, we need to have the virtue of temperance in order to see the good as it is, so as not to be enslaved by it. So St. Gregory the Great, my patron, says that we experience a kind of, what would you call it, an inverse movement when it comes to sense goods, and then when it comes to greater than sense goods, what would you call those? Like intelligible goods. So he says with sense goods, if you indulge in them, initially there's a nice little kind of kickback. You experience delight and it's wonderful, but then as you continue to indulge in them, the delight that they afford tends to decrease. So you can think about maybe your experience of dessert. You have one dessert, it was awesome, you think I want another dessert, and then, I don't know, maybe 7 times out of 10 you're like, I shouldn't have had that second dessert. So when we overindulge in sense delights, they tend to depreciate in value. All right. Now he says, by contrast with intelligible goods, the exact opposite takes place. So your first experience, for instance, of trying to make a holy hour was probably exceedingly difficult. You were bored and you were like, when is this going to end? And then you checked your watch and then you moved in your seat and then you fell asleep and then you entertained distractions and then you did it all over again. Okay. But if you continue to pursue that good, it gets easier, it gets more prompt, it gets more joyful, and then the good itself tends to become more and more engrossing. You become drawn into, or you are drawn into, the life of prayer as a result of your commitment to that good. So, on the one hand, if we overindulge in sense goods, they tend to depreciate, but on the other hand, if we indulge in spiritual goods, if we indulge in intelligible goods, they tend to appreciate. So the point of the virtue of temperance is that it helps us to mature into the preference of intelligible goods. So that when we look at a plate of chocolate chip cookies, we're like, looks delicious, I will have 1 or 2, or looks delicious, I will wait to the end of the meal, or looks delicious, I'll offer it to my guests before I take some for myself, right? So that we can actually see those sense goods from a perspective of reason, healed and elevated by grace. And then when we see intelligible goods, like, you know, hey, do you want to come with me to this holy hour? You're like, I haven't prayed yet today. I would love to, right? It's something where you don't hesitate. It's something where you just go about it because it draws you, because it beckons you, because it seduces you, right? So then the question is, why are you talking about this, and where does fasting and abstinence fit in? Well, in order to grow in the virtue of temperance, we need first the grace of God, but we also need to consent to and cooperate with that grace. So we need to perform acts that are themselves temperate in order to dispose ourselves to an increase in the virtue of temperance. And 2 such acts are fasting and abstinence. Now, as with most things in life, I think it's good to have a somewhat gradual approach to this, but I think that we shouldn't say, okay, today I'm not going to snack between 11 and 12 p.m. and then tomorrow I'm not going to snack between 10 and 12 p.m. and then the next day I'm not going to snack between 9 and 12 p.m. You can just say, today I'm not going to snack after dinner, all right? So we don't have to break it up into infinite amounts of steps, because at a certain level it's always going to be at least a little bit difficult, and we're going to have to confront that difficulty at a certain point. This specific question asks, at what point does the difficulty become so great that it's actually distracting, or that it might actually undermine the goal that I undertake when adopting the practice? And here, we're talking about a consideration that's proper to the virtue of prudence. Short answer is, I don't know. It's going to depend on you, but I suspect that you're probably capable of more than you think you are. Because with any, training that we undertake, we're going to have to suffer a bit in order to attain to the good that we desire. I've heard it said, this is quoted to me by a friend named Robbie Toole, who said that at the first point, like say in a race or an athletic competition where you think, I can't go on or I can't do this anymore, you're at 40% of max, all right? You're at 40% of max. You've still got 60% left in the tank. So when we go about trying to discipline our appetite so that we don't get sunk in sense goods and rather can rise to the contemplation of intelligible goods, we're going to have to push ourselves. By God's grace, mind you, not as a personal project whereby we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, but ultimately so as to be given more wholly to the one good, the only good necessary, right? The one thing necessary. So in this spirit, I think it's good to challenge yourself. And if you're the type of person who is perhaps given to heroic feats of strength, maybe you challenge yourself a little bit less. But if you tend to be a little bit wimpy in these matters, maybe challenge yourself a little bit more. And if you need help being challenged, now this would be a great occasion to undertake it with a friend, right? To have some accountability, or to do it in conversation with a spiritual director who is going to have some sense of where penances fit in the life of the church and perhaps what you are capable of at this stage in your spiritual journey. So that way you don't do something that proves damaging to your health and to your spiritual growth. So the question then finally resolves with, well, what if I am grumpy when I endeavor something difficult? Who cares, right? You don't want to be uncharitable to those with whom you live or those with whom you work. But the point of Christian life isn't to be nice, right? The point of the Christian life is to be like God. And in order to become like God, we need to be stretched in the life of grace. And there's very few things like fasting or abstinence which convict us convict us to or convict us about our need for God, our dependence upon God, our utter incapability to do anything worthwhile except for God. So if you adopt a practice which taxes you, right? If you adopt a practice which convinces you that you're not as good as you thought you were, amen. Hallelujah. So be it. That's probably fine. Now, if you adopt a penance which makes you utterly miserable and unable to get out of bed and ultimately, risks forfeiting the life of grace, that's probably too much, right? But that's where the conversation comes in with friends, with accountability partners, with a spiritual director, and with the saints of the church who have adopted these things before us and show us a way to do so in our own lives. So, those are some principles. I hope that they are helpful, and I myself have been convicted as to the need for this in my own life, and so I'm going to take this video as an occasion to take that more seriously. I said take twice, now I've said it 6 times. Who cares? All right, so if you haven't yet, please do subscribe to Pints with Aquinas. Push the subscribe button and then the bell. Stuff happens, it's cool. And then if you haven't yet, please do subscribe to Godsplaining, which is a podcast to which I contribute with 4 other Dominican friars of the province of St. Joseph. So push the subscribe button, push the bell, sweet stuff happens. Everyone goes home happy, except for those who don't, but why, I know not. All right, so my prayers are for you. Please pray for me, and I'll catch you next time on Pints with Aquinas.